This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel, and the Israel Institute, enhancing knowledge and study of modern Israel. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern, and my guest today is a professor of Hebrew Studies at Dartmouth College, and the author of a new book with a straightforward title, The Story of Hebrew. It was recently published in English by Princeton University Press. Joining us on the line from Massachusetts is Professor Louis Glinert. Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Hello, greetings. As I say in Hebrew, hi, Alan, shalom.
Shalom to you too. But your book is a detailed biography of the Hebrew language from the ancient kingdom of Israel, the modern state of Israel, a 2,500-year lifespan, throughout most of which it was mostly associated with the Jewish religion. Now, my question to you is, can the story of Hebrew be separated from the story of Judaism, or does telling one necessarily entail telling the other?
I'd say that for most of that period, and by the way, I'd actually make it more like 3,300 years, for most of that period, in fact, almost that entire period, Hebrew was synonymous with the existence of a Jewish people, a Jewish religion, let's call it Judaism. But over the last 150 years, some very powerful forces were trying to actually dissociate it, to the extent that when the Yishuv, the new Jewish presence in the Holy Land began, there were strong voices for actually making Hebrew a religion substitute, a substitute for Judaism. And that's when things get really interesting and very confusing.
But that is just a tiny fraction of the whole story, isn't it?
Oh yeah, a tiny fraction.
So your answer to my question, if I understand it correctly, is that they cannot be separated. When you tell the story of Hebrew, you, ipso facto, tell the story of Judaism as well.
Yeah, and we can look at it both ways. Judaism without Hebrew would have made no sense. Hebrew without Judaism would have made no sense.
So what is it about the story of Hebrew that, stands out in that historical exploration as opposed to other histories of Judaism?
Well, you could say that for most of that period, 2,000 years of diaspora, Judaism revolved around a vast set of sacred texts. The Tanakh, in other words, the Hebrew Bible, the writings of the ancient rabbis, the Mishnah, the Gemara, etc., Midrash, and then a large body of texts that serve to explain and elaborate on those texts. Those texts, including great poetry and great prose, were concerned above all with Judaism, with Jewish identity, and they were usually in Hebrew. The assumption was from a very early time that if you don't have that direct connection with the foundational texts, above all the Tanakh, then Judaism has lost half of its meaning. It's like kissing the bride through the veil.
And if we look at the period when Hebrew was a spoken language, before it died, as it were, do we have a notion of what it was like? I mean, if we compare nationality, for example, so the question of sovereignty in ancient times and today's modern Israel, these are very, very different notions indeed. Can you say the same about Hebrew as a spoken language? What did it look like back then?
Yeah, we have an idea what it looked like. Sadly, we don't have much an idea what it sounded like. We can look at so many wonderful snippets of Hebrew that have emerged from the archaeologists' spade. Take, for example, maybe to me the most remarkable, a tiny silver amulet that was discovered in Jerusalem, a place called Ketef Ben Hinnom, some 30 years ago. they managed to get it open, and in it were the priestly blessings, the Birkat Kohanim, 3 verses, almost identical with what we have in the Torah today. On the other hand, there have been hundreds of little pieces of pottery dug up saying things like, I owe the king 20 bottles of wine, or please speak to me to the chief of the workforce because I am sick and I need some help. Little calendars of the agricultural year, all kinds of everyday items, a lot of it boring bureaucratic stuff, which show that Hebrew was the language of that whole people in a way it is today.
And what happened? How did it die and why?
Well, as they say, no one wrote the obituary. It died in stages. First of all came the first exile, when the Babylonian armies marched in, laid Jerusalem waste. The Jewish elite were dragged away to what is today Mesopotamia, Iraq, and there for many generations, they and their descendants switched to another language, a sister language of Hebrew called Aramaic. But they didn't forget Hebrew, remarkably. They continued to have a connection with it when the so-called return to Zion, Shivat Zion, took place around the year 500, starting around 530, and a large Jewish population built up again in Eretz Israel. Many of them were speaking Hebrew.
That is BCE, 530 BCE.
Yeah, 530 BCE. Somehow they connected with the Jews who had remained, who had apparently continued to speak Hebrew. So Hebrew was given a new lease of life, at least in what was then Judea, Yehuda, in other words, the Jerusalem district. And there it again became the motor for Jewish life until the Romans came. And then this was starting in the year 63 BCE and culminating in 2 great Jewish wars against Rome in the year 70 of the Common Era, when the Romans destroyed Jerusalem, and then 133 or so, the Bar Kokhba revolt against Rome, and with that, the country was decimated, and Hebrew seems to have died as a spoken language. But the rabbis of the time said, we've got to keep it going as the language of our sacred texts. People will pray in Hebrew, people will study in Hebrew, and they've succeeded.
So keeping Hebrew, the Hebrew flame alive, as it were, was a conscious decision that was later. It wasn't just a turn of events for the coming centuries. It was something that has become a foundational aspect of the Jewish religion. Absolutely.
Rabbi Judah the Prince, Yehuda HaNasi, who was the executive leader of the Jewish people and the rabbinical leader in the 2nd century, 150, 160 of the Common Era, he is on record as saying, we have to keep Hebrew going. And as a result, most of the prayers in the Jewish prayer book, the Siddur, are in Hebrew. Even the Kaddish, which is famously written partly in Aramaic, part of it is in Hebrew. The knowledge of how to understand the Torah, the Midrash, in the 1st centuries, it was written in Hebrew. The Mishnah, the Code of Jewish Law, all in Hebrew. And people have gone on learning Hebrew in order to understand it and to explain it. And so Hebrew continued written and, if you like, in your prayers, spoken.
Would you say that Hebrew, throughout its millennia-long history, remained pretty much intact? Can you look at it as one linguistic entity?
Well, linguists always say languages never stop changing. And even when, as it were, put to sleep, but of course in Hebrew's case, it depends what we mean by sleep, they don't stop changing. The reason for this is something which is quite remarkable. Hebrew was not simply a language of passive texts. It was a language that Jews felt an urge to use themselves and not just to explain those texts, but to bare their souls. The greatest lyrical poetry in medieval Spain, in Italy, songs of praise, songs of woe. For example, the Kinot, the laments that Jews chant on Tisha B'Av, the saddest day in the Jewish year, marking the destruction of the temple. They're in Hebrew. Every aspect of Jewish creativity and Jewish soul was poured into Hebrew. So the language kept on changing. And besides that, there was actually a tremendous interest in developing the language. Jews often felt very uncomfortable looking around and seeing how rich Arabic was, how rich Latin was, and they did their best to write grammars, to develop dictionaries, to develop a whole new vocabulary for even science, technology, great works of medicine, great works of astronomy written in Hebrew, new words coming up all the time. Anyone who thinks that the development of technical scientific Hebrew had to wait till the 20th century just doesn't get it.
So describing Hebrew as a dead language is basically a myth. As you say in the book, you dispel that myth.
Yeah, the word dead is just off the agenda.
Mm-hmm. How is it then different from Latin? That was also the language of the scriptures, of the sages, that had also very strong religious, theological connotation. Are there any parallels to be made, or is it just some sort of, amateur way of looking at it?
There are some parallels, but the differences really leap out at you. The parallels, well, you've got two languages that appear to be academic languages. But, of course, they're not really. Latin was also a language in the Middle Ages of great creativity. However, that was a language of a tiny elite, the church and the scholarly elite. Hebrew was, down the centuries, the language of a vast mass of Jews. Most of those who went and studied Hebrew for scholarly purposes were men. Women were generally expected to learn to read Hebrew and say their prayers, maybe understand Shema, understand the prayers for Hadlakat Nerot, the lighting of the candles. But still, a vast number of Jews were connected with Hebrew. That was never the case for Latin. And then, by the time you get to the 18th century, Latin's a dead loss. Everyone is more or less, even people like Isaac Newton, who still wrote their optics in Latin. This was already the end for Latin, except for poor school kids. But for Hebrew, that thing never happened. Hebrew continued right up to the point where, as it were, one generation reaches out to another in the 19th century and says, we're going to bring the Sleeping Beauty back fully awake.
So would you say that Hebrew for the Jews was some sort of defense mechanism, a way of keeping cohesive entity in, surrounded by hostile populations?
Well, in the Arab world, yes, because Jews there always had the option learn to write Arabic. Many of them did, and some of the greatest Hebrew works in the Middle Ages were in Arabic. So there you could say Hebrew was a kind of defense mechanism showing we are the equal of everything that the Arab culture has to offer. In the Christian world, there was no choice. Jews had no access to Latin because they didn't go to church school. So for them, Hebrew was the natural way that you wrote anything serious.
Are there any instances in history where the Jews gave up Hebrew and, just perhaps stuck to the very essentials of prayer, but other than that, had absolutely no affinity with Hebrew? I'm trying to understand how essential really Hebrew was for the perpetuation of Jewish culture in the diaspora.
Yeah, up until the late 18th, early 19th century, it was taken for granted that if you wanted to write a poem, if you wanted to write a tombstone, if you wanted to write about the great Jewish texts, you did it in Hebrew. But things changed dramatically around the beginning of the 19th century with the development of what's called the modern Jewish emancipation. Jews were allowed into Christian society. Jews were allowed to become doctors, and Jews were allowed to work in whatever fields they wanted and live where they wanted. This is 19th century Jewish Germany and France, England, and soon, eventually, in Russia. And once they were allowed to attend regular public school, and soon they would be forced to do it, like my great-grandparents living in southern Poland under Austrian rule had to study German, had to go to public school. Once that happens, the dam breaks, and Jews forget about Hebrew except as a ritual language. And that's really where it is for the vast majority of American Jews today.
Mm-hmm. However, at the same time, with the advent of Haskalah, as you say in the book, the revival of Hebrew wasn't a function of the rise of Zionism. It preceded that with the rise of Haskalah. So we have really a dual process here, don't we?
Yeah, it's interesting how often people imagine that modern Hebrew is synonymous with Zionism, but no, the modern Hebrew, modernization of Hebrew, really began 2-3 generations before that. It was part of an attempt to bring Jews in Poland, in Germany, in America, into the modern world. And so the early, let's call them enlightened Jewish intellectuals, I'm putting that word in quotes, obviously, in Germany and Russia and England, they had the idea that Hebrew could compete with English and Russian and German and could claim a place in the sun as a language of modern life, a kind of classical language, but updated, and to be the language of newspapers and school books and scientific textbooks and magazines, the whole works. And for a couple of generations, there were thousands of people who believed this was a possibility. But history caught up with them because most of the people that they were speaking preferred simply Russian, German, English. Hebrew just didn't seem to have a point.
Mm-hmm. But this, you say, universal horizon of Hebrew wasn't really only confined to that period, because, as you say, it also piqued the interest of Christian theologians before that in the Middle Ages, because it was, after all, the language of the Old Testament, of the very early tenets of their religion as well.
Yeah, this is another irony in a story that is full of ironies. For a long time, it seemed that the church had no real need for Hebrew, provided it had good translations of the Hebrew scriptures. We have to remember that for the church, unlike for the Muslims, the Jewish scriptures were sacred. And so, going back to the 4th century, Jerome in Italy decides that he's going to go to the rabbis, learn Hebrew well enough to go and write what he thought was a correct form of the Hebrew Bible in Latin. That becomes the bestseller, and everyone's happy. No need for Hebrew. Another 700-800 years down the line, people start complaining. We've got too many competing translations of the Hebrew Bible. We don't know which Latin translation is the best. Again, let's go back to the original. It was, above all, an attempt to get to the basics of the meaning of the Hebrew Bible for Christian purposes. But then in the Middle Ages, another much more disturbing kind of interest in Hebrew emerges, and that is the desire to use Hebrew to convert the Jews. Starting in the 13th century, the Dominican and Franciscan orders, they say, let's go out and convert the Jews. To do that, we've got to show them we know their Bible better than they do. We know that they have misunderstood it. We know that on every page there is evidence that Christianity is true. And so we are going to make sure that we have an army of Christians who know Hebrew. And out of that develops a whole new Christian interest in the language, and it peaks in the Renaissance. in the 15th, 16th century when Christians discover the Kabbalah. And for them, the Kabbalah was secret Jewish information that was really evidence that Christianity was true. They found references to Christian ideas all over the place. And for them, that was, again, a need to get to the Jewish texts in Hebrew and also Aramaic. So that was the peak. And from then you could say it's downhill. Today, I don't think there are many Christians who have any particular interest in knowing Hebrew for any kind of religious purposes.
Mm-hmm. Well, there are fewer Christians and they are less powerful than they were at the time, so maybe it has to do with that. But I'd like to ask you on that same issue, how great do you think is the influence of Hebrew on Western civilization writ large? I mean, given that one of the constitutive texts was indeed written in Hebrew.
This is quite remarkable. You've got to dig just a little bit and you find that some of the greatest authors that we hold dear, people like Walt Whitman and John Donne, great English 17th century poet, even Shakespeare, Hebrew terminology is everywhere under the carpet. Take the Merchant of Venice. The quality of mercy is not strained, it droppeth like the gentle dew from heaven. Portia's famous speech in the Merchant of Venice. It sounds like it's translated directly from the Hebrew. There was such an everyday working knowledge of the Hebrew Bible, a kind of knowledge that most Jews today would be envious of. And maybe the jewel in the crown is what's called the authorized King James version of the Bible, which was created in a glorious English full of Hebrew rhythms. They wanted to basically take the Hebrew structure of the Bible and word for word turn it into English. They created a new English. And that became the basis of so many things that people sang, Handel's Messiah, the Common Book of Prayer. It was all over the place. You've just got to dig for it. Even things like the great I Have a Dream, Martin Luther King, they're full of Hebraic rhythms.
Mm-hmm. So do you think that maybe one day Hebrew will be taught in public schools alongside ancient Greek and Latin as, a foundational language of Western civilization? Or do you think it should be done?
This will sound like special pleading, but I really think it ought to. Unfortunately, the time has passed when you can expect the average high school student to study Latin, let alone Greek. So that would really be asking a bit much. Maybe if the Israeli economy reaches a point where everyone needs to know Hebrew to do business with Israel. Otherwise, I can't imagine it.
I don't think that's likely to happen. I think that either hell will freeze over first or all Israelis will be fluent in English, which is pretty much what it is today. Anyway, Professor Louis Glinert, Professor of Hebrew Studies at Dartmouth College and the author of the newly published The Story of Hebrew. Thank you very much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And also big thanks to Gizem Ozdemir, our sound engineer, and to the Van Leer Institute and the Israel Institute for the generous support. If you like this podcast, there are many more where it came from. Just go to www.tlv1.fm/podcasts and take your pick. Our co-host, Dalia Shendlin, will be back with us shortly. But in the meantime, don't forget to follow us on Facebook. Our page is called The Tel Aviv Review Ideas from Israel. And follow us on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review, and until then, goodbye.